Hi everyone. Well, welcome to the second episode of the Silmarillion sessions, as we're calling them. As slightly awful as that name might be and cringe-inducing, but anyway, it goes okay. I'm here with Sridhar, so say hello, Sridhar. Say hello to, I don't know, our guests.
Hey there, how's it going? This is not as much like a hostage podcast as it's sounding like already.
So Sridhar, you've become famous because, as we were just talking about before the podcast, you wrote an article about the Ukraine war that's currently going on, which seems to have got some traction. So for those listeners who are interested, you can find that on Aereo magazine. And it's a great article, so I'd recommend people read it. And
thank you.
People are listening to
it's too kind.
If people like what you've written, come and you can come to listen to the podcast and hear more of what Sridhar has to say here. So, although for the most part, we don't talk about Ukraine or current events, but who knows, we might do that at some point.
Yeah.
So today
we should do a whole episode where we compare different wars.
Well,
in the history of
it's interesting
Middle Earth,
actually. I have seen some comparisons, like as Putin as the Dark Lord sort of thing, and Ukraine as sort of the embattled West. So, I don't know. I guess there's definitely parallels to be drawn there.
I think I see the inklings of your next Aereo essay.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah. No, I think my days of trying to write for publications are over. But anyway, or at least non-academic ones. Takes too much effort, too much time, too much. Yeah. Anyway, I don't know. It's just me. So today, at any rate, we're talking about chapters 1 to 4 of the Silmarillion inclusive. And so these are, the beginning of days, chapter 1, Aule and Yavanna, chapter 2, and then chapter 3, coming of the elves, and chapter 4 is, what's chapter 4 again? Oh, Thingol and Melian. Yes, that's right. The very briefly told love story in that chapter. So we just wanted to spend one episode on these chapters because they're all relatively short, and we can sort of take them as sort of chunks. So we'll probably do that going forward until we get to some of the very long chapters towards the end. Of course, the Baron and Luthien and some of those later chapters. So which are sort of more self-contained stories. So. That's the plan anyway. So we're just going to have a free-ranging kind of discussion. I didn't write many notes for this, so we'll see how we go. But, I think there's some interesting material to think about. But, I guess first of all, what were your thoughts on these chapters? Obviously, we really begin, I suppose, the story of the Silmarils here, as per the title. We have the creation of first the lamps and then the two trees and then, of course, the Silmarils. And I think what's really interesting is, as many sort of scholars have pointed out, we're faced with a gradual diminution of light, and by sort of symbolic extension, truth, beauty, symmetry, perfection, whatever you want to call it, and sort of the gradual. I don't know how to explain it. I guess the gradual disintegration of that sort of primal, sort of singular creative power, which is dispersed gradually, both by sort of by Melkor, the sort of Satan figure, but also, as a result almost of entropy as well, which I think is the main sort of theme of the book, the whole Tolkien's Legendarium. So, we really see that process begin here, but at least mythologically. So, initial thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, just to the to that point, I think it's interesting that the after the it seems like there's a peak of light reached that though there may be like valleys and then hills again, that each subsequent peak is is less. If that makes sense. So I find that like an interesting kind of, or at least that's my interpretation of it. So
yeah.
I could be wrong on that, but that's like an interesting thing. It's not like a linear decline necessarily. But or is it?
No, I think that's right. That's right to sort of think about that, because I think it seems that perhaps we can read it several ways as a kind of decline, but then you could also take if you take the sort of theodicies seriously, the idea that, discord and disharmony sort of somehow works to create more beauty, out of tension, I suppose. Then one could argue that, well, actually, that original sort of unity, sort of symbolized by these lamps, I guess, and then, of course, by the two trees, more famously, perhaps. One could say that, I suppose, that although it was sort of symmetrical and perfect, and there was something missing in that sort of. There's something beautiful in sort of perhaps the symmetry, but also the breaking of symmetry as well in a different kind of sense. So I think one could take it both ways. And something I noted in reading this time was, one question I had was whether or not in the book as a whole, but especially in these chapters, we can think about, whether there's a contradiction between this notion that the world was originally primarily perfect and beautiful, and the notion, as I've just explained, that sort of evil, if you like, or somehow the forces of disunity, the idea that this creates more beautiful things, if there's a contradiction there. If one can have the beauty, that singular original beauty without the discord of Melkor, or more abstractly without the sort of reality of entropy and the sort of the reality of things dissolving and passing away, then why is it necessary in the first place to actually have Melkor, is that we're introduced as a kind of principle into the universe, that principle of discord? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think this may be obvious, but I think Tolkien kind of does a smaller version of that between the elves and men.
Yeah.
And I think my hunch is that he answers that question for us by saying that the discord is part of the beauty, because he seems to. It seems to me that Tolkien slightly favors the man. So,
not in that sense.
Yeah, clip it. Yeah. We got our soundbite.
I also favor the men. Yeah.
But,
Sorry, terrible.
We should clip that and use it to piss off all the people on Reddit. But yeah, I think that question that you have, that's like a bigger version of the question of the role of mortality and the sort of ability to be corrupted between elves and men, and what their worth or what their role in the universe is. And maybe it's not fair to say that he favors one over the other, but it seems to me that certainly men are obviously crucial in their role here, as being more sort of like figures who are subject to entropy. So I don't know, it seems like he answers that question with his own creations.
Yeah, although I think the elves are too, just in a different way, perhaps, because they themselves don't obviously die, but the world around them does. So they're faced with a sort of a different dilemma in that sense, which of course brings the rings into the story originally, eventually is the word I'm looking for. But yeah, I think that's an interesting sort of dilemma, maybe, that these first few chapters introduce, because we have the creation of these major symbolic, mythological sort of instantiations of that sort of primal, creative, beautiful, however you want to describe it, sort of light, symbolized here by light, of course, and then that's successively sort of broken up into smaller pieces and eventually into the Silmarils themselves, these jewels which embody that light and then sort of maintain that memory into history, as it were. But that original primal light can never sort of be re-accessed. You can't sort of go back there and access it again. And eventually in the myth, and we'll get to this, I suppose, when we get to the chapter on the sun and moon, eventually we're left with the sun and moon, which are in the mythological frame sort of imperfect records of that original primal light. So, it's interesting how that sort of cascades down from, from the terrestrial plane and eventually into a sort of into the inaccessible plane of the sky. But in these chapters, at any rate, we just get to the point where the two trees are made, and we haven't lost them yet, of course. But the two trees are made. The lamps are lost on the first page or the second page, and so that primal light doesn't of course stick around for very long. We immediately get into the story, and this of course results in the capture and chaining of Melkor. Then the elves come into the scene, and they are these creations, I suppose, that the Valar know about, but they don't really have any sense of how to deal with these, these new sort of speaking creatures. And then there's uncertainty about how to treat them, what to do, and eventually, of course, they invite these elves to Valinor, their sort of paradisical home, and that sort of brings about a whole lot of consequences for the rest of the history of this particular world, which one could sort of argue over as to whether or not it's sort of triumphant history or not, but it's certainly a dramatic one. And so really, I suppose, that history begins, in a sense, at least for the elves and the men, in that decision to bring the elves to paradise and to ask them to forsake their original homes and therefore to become sort of exiles. I don't know, what did you think about that particular theme? I mean, obviously, even the book makes a note of saying that. I can find it here. It makes a note of saying that from this summons came many woes that befell, or that afterwards befell in chapter 3, I think it is, of the coming of the elves. So, clearly we're meant to, I suppose, approach this whole development with some degree of apprehension.
And this is one of the things that I wasn't quite clear on. Unless if I missed it, maybe that's why. But why exactly is this a problematic decision? Is I guess what I don't understand.
I suppose it depends on your point of view, but one answer is that it's problematic because it immediately removes the elves from their homeland, I suppose, from the place where they awake in this mythological kind of setting. And yes, they're transported to paradise. Yes, they become sort of ennobled and enriched by this. But but in the process, they lose something. They lose a place, I guess. They lose their place in Middle Earth, and there are some later texts which even give a somewhat more one might say, Marxist reading of this, which is that, the elves felt that they had lost their places at sort of the top of the hierarchy, and in Valinor they're at the bottom of the hierarchy because, of course, they're literally living amongst the gods. So, in comparison, in paradise, they're sort of the lowest rung sort of thing. I mean, not that presumably not that means anything really for their lifestyles or anything, but at least in Middle-earth, they were able to sort of exercise some degree of control and dominion over their environment, which is exactly why later in the story we will see several elves return to Middle-earth. But so I think that's why, because although it seems at first glance that it might be a positive move, it has a result of deracinating the elves, I guess, from their original homeland, and therefore creating all sorts of, let's say, unresolved psychological issues, which certain of them later take up, in their rebellion against the Valar. So I don't know. That's the answer I'd give. Yeah.
So it's more of I may have been doing too maybe too literal of a reading or something. So it's more pinpointing this as the sort of, like you said, the beginning of history moment, but only from the point of knowing what is to come. It's not that in that moment that was an obviously faulted decision, correct?
Yeah,
or
that's
no?
Right. Yeah, yeah.
So, it's only from the perspective of, I guess, hindsight. That
yes, and
it's horrendous.
And something we'll see, I think, as we go forward is this book is written, in hindsight. Obviously, I mean, it is a sort of
sure.
It is I take it as a mythological retelling, if you like, of certain historical events. I mean, this is a big debate, which I've talked about several of my guests with, how literally does one take the Silmarillion within the context of this story world? And I think that's actually a really interesting question because, when we read a novel, we sort of expect that the world that we're being invited to observe, in a sense, is in some sense instantiated in a kind of story world which is real. But do we think the same? Mythological texts perhaps function a bit differently. Are we necessarily being invited to imagine that the elves were literally dragged across the ocean on an island by a giant god, or that the sun and moon are literally the fruits of the two trees? If we take, for example, the world of the Lord of the Rings, which seems to us quite to obtain a degree of verisimilitude comparable to a novel, the kind of verisimilitude you might encounter in a novel, do we then turn to the Silmarillion and say, well, although there are complications there as well, but I won't go into that, but do we then turn to the Silmarillion and say, well, there's an equal degree of verisimilitude, you just have to sort of, while you're reading the text, you enter into a kind of secondary belief and everything sort of transpires as it's said. But as I've spoken with several scholars on this podcast, one can detect, of course, certain elements of bias in the narrative. One can detect, as you've just noticed there, that it's told from not only hindsight, but probably quite a gulf of time, has passed between, say, the, in inverted commas, the writing of the text, in the story world and the actual, again, inverted commas, actual events that are taking place.
It's almost like an omniscient hindsight,
Well, it thinks it is, yes.
It's not merely like it. Yeah. It's not merely historical hindsight. It's
yes, yeah.
It's not only like we know how it happened, but like we know how just how we know the whole thing. It's more or less yeah.
But then there are features of the text which sort of give away its status maybe as something that's not quite omniscient in its in its approach, which we'll perhaps encounter later. And I think, for me anyway, one of those features is just that at least these early chapters are so heavily mythologized. From my point of view anyway, I don't sort of read the text and believe that this is literally taking place. Even in the story world, it's so sort of, as I said, it's so mythologized that it, I couldn't imagine such a world literally being, ever being the case. It obtains its power, I think, out of its symbolic and sort of mythological dimensions. And I don't know, that's at least how I think about it.
No, that's a good point. That's actually a really good point.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. That might change the way that I read it going forward, which, that's always a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, people would disagree with me. I think I'm in the minority. I think a lot of Tolkien fans would want to say, well, no, it's just, it literally is, it is to be taken literally. It is to be taken as sort of a true representation of events. And even Tolkien himself later in life seems to have wanted to, reshape the Silmarillion text so it became something more like that. It's almost as though he sort of forgot about the mythological dimension of the text, and because his excuse was, well, that the elves, who are sort of meant to be these paragons of knowledge and etc., would know, for example, that the sun and the moon had always existed in astronomical terms. They would not sort of generate a myth whereby the sun and moon are the fruits of these, mythological trees, right? But I think Tolkien himself probably missed the point there. he missed the point in his old age. I think he missed the point of his youngest self, and I think it's interesting when authors do that, but I think they clearly do sometimes.
Yeah. I'm reminded of when the Canadian pianist Glenn Gould, he was playing some Canadian composer's piece. I forget who. I don't want to say any name in case I'm wrong and I slander someone, but the composer was sitting in on the rehearsal, and he sort of sat up during a break and was trying to give Glenn Gould all these notes. And Glenn Gould just said, "Oh, please sit down, Mr. So-and-so. You have no idea how your piece goes."
Amazing. Yeah, that's a great anecdote.
So, I'm imagining you as Glenn Gould here.
I would never presume, but I think in the context of discussing it, we can at least hypothesize.
Yeah.
I think this is another good example, though, where it's good sometimes to realize that the author, not just Tolkien, but any author, although I think it's perhaps important in Tolkien's case, go through phases of creativity, and sometimes one can sort of really isolate the phases. Sometimes it's harder. I think for Tolkien, it's evident that the last part of his life was a phase. I would call it, in some senses, a less creative phase, because he's not trying to finish or rewrite the stories that he'd produced earlier in his life, sometimes very early, but he's trying to assimilate them into all sorts of other kinds of considerations, like the considerations like that which I just mentioned, that the notion that astronomical truth somehow had to be accommodated into the myth because some feature that the elves possess, that or that these characters possess, that is that supposedly that they would have knowledge of that. But of course, once you go down that path, I don't think I think very few features of the text would actually withstand scrutiny, because of course we're not talking about the real world, we're talking about a story world. So in that sense, I don't see the problem.
This is going really far afield.
That's right.
But have you ever read or know of I think it's called On Late Style by Edward Said?
No, but
you might be interested. And I don't, as far as I know, he didn't write about Tolkien in this, but
probably not,
yeah, it's a book of like criticism of various artists, including Beethoven and Mozart and I forget who else. I think he may actually talk about Glenn Gould a little bit too, but the premise is basically, or his thesis is basically that there's certain artists who, by the sort of creative magnitude of their early and middle work, they get to a phase in their late work where they either find no feasible place to go, further than they've already gone, or they've already, by their earlier work, have wrapped themselves in glorious contradiction, and they have no way to sort of wrap up what they've gotten themselves into.
I think that describes Tolkien perfectly.
Yeah. So there's a whole phenomenon of like very great artists, some of who produce very dodgy late work, and not to say that it's all bad. It's just sometimes it reaches these peaks, and then other times you're like, he just seems confused here. And then I wonder if there is something there where you get yourself into something that is as crazy as, the entire sort of Middle Earth legendarium, and then you get to a point and you're like, there's no human mind that can really wrap that up neatly.
Yeah, and I think a perfect instantiation of that is the Nature of Middle Earth book that came out recently, and I discussed that with I discussed that recently on the podcast, of course, which you can listen to. But I think that book is sort of now a little notorious because it's full of these sort of mathematical tables trying to sort of work out elvish lifespans in this sort of granular detail. This is not information that probably would have survived until the ravages of time, and yet it's as though Tolkien's almost forgot his earlier process of sort of writing his history as though from a great distance, right? In terms of time. And yeah, I think it's an interesting book, but I think it's a monument to Tolkien's final creative period, which I think would totally agree with Said's late style idea. An artist who has sort of lost the creative impulse, or at least how to explain it. I mean, obviously there's still creativity there. There's still thinking. There's still analysis, but it's
have sort of gotten tangled up in their own.
It's commentary on Aristotle. It's not new thinking. It's not responding to Aristotle, as it were, in a way that either updates or renews his ideas. It's a way that it's simply trying to discern the minutiae and rule out contradictions where these things are not actually important, where the contradictions and the minutiae sort of are beside the point. I know this is taking us off that chapters 1 to 5, or 1 to 4, but I think it's important because in these chapters we're really talking about the development of that myth, and I think it's this version of the myth which really was developed quite early, and then it was fairly stable up until the writing of the Lord of the Rings and even beyond. It's really that version of the myth that I think is the version that is most creatively, most sort of mythologically, symbolically interesting, and that later thinking is I think we can fairly say is a less interesting project. It is not it's not as creatively profound. And I don't. That's my opinion anyway. But it's interesting that some writers later have, some commenters on Tolkien, discussing the Silmarillion, which of course was published posthumously by his son. Some have complained, well, this is not the Silmarillion that Tolkien would have written. Well, it's like, which period of Tolkien's life are you talking about, though? I mean, there's this sort of, I think in some critiques, there's this implicit idea that had Tolkien lived, we would have eventually got a Silmarillion that would have been his Silmarillion, that would have been the canonical kind of Silmarillion. And for a lot of people, I think that is a Silmarillion that is much more it's much more theologically orthodox. It's more, it incorporates more of his sort of later fiddling with regards to, as I've talked about, with regards to minutiae, incorporates sort of some of these later dialogues that are included in the History of Middle-earth books, which all invariably are much more sort of theologically than mythologically inspired. Again, another theme in Tolkien's later work was trying to square his religious faith with the work. But I think all of that would have lost this mythological, or at least it would have diluted that mythological quality, which I think would have been a creatively bankrupt thing for him to have done. And had he lived long enough to actually release a Silmarillion, and at least if he'd remained in that phase, I think it would have been a less creatively less interesting than the one we've got, which is really reflects the moment where it was when he wrote The Lord of the Rings, which I think is the appropriate Silmarillion to have, because that's the most powerful instantiation of his creative, of his creativity in that book. And so I think it's appropriate to have the Silmarillion of that phase, and not a later phase where, yes, it might have been, had he lived a bit longer, maybe he would have published it, but I think it would have been a less profound work, going off what we've seen in The Nature of Middle-earth, for example. Sorry, rant. That's over.
That's a very interesting point. I find that absolutely fascinating that you think that. I'm inclined to agree, though I don't know enough to have an opinion. But based on your interpretation of what's going on, I'm on your side.
But anyway, sorry. Yeah. Were there any other? No. I mean, we've got these 5 chapters, and we've sort of gone over the very high. The plot at a sort of high level, but of course we have the creation of the dwarves in this story of Ale and Yavanna, and then of course we have the meeting of the sort of demigod Melian with Thingol, who's one of the elves, who becomes the king of the elves, and this is really setting up later story, of course. But I guess that.
So yeah. Wait, sorry. But before we get too far ahead, I had a question which is possibly stupid about the dwarves.
Yeah.
So, well, just a comment. I found it quite interesting that it just seems to be. I was sort of reading it and kind of thinking that it's a real hodgepodge of of myths. Like how do you say it? Is it Aule? Aule? I don't know how you say it. Yeah. He seems to be, he seems to be a vaguely Promethean figure, and then there's also a sort of Abraham, Isaac moment. But the thing with the fact that he made the dwarves before the men and the elves were awoken. But then, Iluvatar wants, he basically sort of, puts them on hold until his firstborn are awoken and blah, blah, blah. I was just wondering, obviously it's like that because Tolkien wanted it to be like that, but I was just wondering, what you think of that and where that places the dwarfs, structurally, in relation to the other species, races, whatever the thing is. It just seems like a weird detail that he obviously had to have really thought about too, because it's not accidental, but I just couldn't place what he may have been thinking.
Well, I think a lot of people
about that detail.
Think about this in theological terms. This chapter, they think, it's sort of, and in some sense, I think this chapter, this Ale and Yavanna, the creation of the dwarves chapter, is in some sense the most biblically. It's the closest to sort of biblical themes. I think you have a sort of a rather overbearing God figure who's sort of in who creativity is instantiated and doesn't share it around. Apart from sort of at the last moment, you mentioned the comparison to Isaac, that story in the Bible, Abraham and Isaac story, which is an interesting one. And, a lot of people think about it that way. Again, I think about it in sort of metatextual way, as I increasingly do reading this. And again, it's sort of one element that I feel reveals the sort of bias of the text, which is from this elvish point of view. I suspect if you ask the dwarves, they would not tell this story because, of course, what does the story do? It really does place the dwarves in a kind of, if not subservient, but they're a kind of secondary, imperfect product, right?
They're the second born.
Well, literally, yeah,
a lesser being.
Yeah. They're not thought of by the original God. They're sort of so. even though it's said that the dwarves sort of they revere or worship, maybe not worship, but they revere Aule. So obviously he's a sort of important figure, and he is a smith, obviously. So no doubt the dwarves have some story where they're created by Aule, but I suspect it would be a bit different. We don't really have a dwarvish story of dwarvish origins. I don't think that there is something said in the appendices, I think, of the Lord of the Rings. But I can't remember that exactly right now. But I suspect it wouldn't have the same kind of valence as this. So, again, it comes back to this issue. Is this the sort of canonical story of the dwarves' origin, or do we take it, again, as a kind of, mythological, theological reflection on the dwarves from the point of view of the elves? Although it's not unkind to the dwarves, it does have the effect of sort of, again, placing them in a kind of, in a position which is perhaps not quite as elevated. I don't know of any culture who would, that would necessarily agree to a story like that. So, I tend to think that, this is another instance where one can read it in a couple of ways, as a kind of just, on the surface as an account of what happened, or within the story world even as a kind of one version of the story. I don't know if that answers your question, but
no, that once again you've hit the bullseye. I think you've totally sold me on that. That kind of reminds me of the way that the Hindu caste system is often portrayed. With you'll see these depictions where the Brahmins, like the priestly class, which are the sort of quote unquote upper caste figures, they'll put themselves in the sort of head area of the sort of god, godlike instantiation of, like, the entire world's energy. And then, as the casts, quote, get lower and lower, you'll find people who are the arms, and then eventually like the feet. And I always wonder, like, it's very convenient that the priests put themselves on the heads. I'm not sure that the people, I'm not sure that the foot people would put themselves there.
Yeah, and you can always make excuses, right? You can always say, well, the foot people, the feet are necessary for walking. They're just as important as the head, which I'm sure they do make those kind of excuses.
That's exactly what they say, but I find it very convenient that it's the head people saying that.
Yeah. So exactly. So I'm sure the elves would say, well, but Iluvatar, this god figure, eventually allows them to exist, gives them life. So they're just as much children as elves or men. They're just, they just happen to have been devised by Aule. But of course, there's still a kind of sense of, well, yeah, that's true. It's kind of, it's a convenient, it's a convenient element which allows for the story or allows for a bit of plausible deniability on the part of the elves. We're not really putting the dwarves down, but we kind of are. And now, maybe this is too cynical a way to approach this text. And, as I said, people mostly read this in a kind of theological way. It's saying something about Tolkien's belief about God, or, the role of God in this universe, the theology of the universe, etc. And yes, it is, but, I don't know. But if we're actually going to take this seriously as a kind of pseudo-historical text, we can't just take at face value what it says, I think, anyway. And I think a lot of scholarship on the Silmarillion is starting to say the same thing.
That's fascinating.
But sorry, I feel like I've ranted so much in this.
No. I mean, I'm loving this. I think you're making some really interesting points that I was not considering. So where to next? Sorry, that was
no. That's fine. I mean, yeah. So I think that's that's an interesting. And another point in this chapter at the end, where sort of Aule and Yavanna, his spouse, have a bit of a chat about these sort of categories of living things, and of course, this is a fairly famous debate within Silmarillion aficionados anyway, if no one else. But another reason I call this the most biblical chapter is because there is this notion put here that that the earth, the plants and the animals of the earth are sort of put there for the children of Iluvatar, for their use. They will, it's that very sort of biblical idea of dominionism. Now, this, if you read The Lord of the Rings, I don't think that's the idea you get. I don't think it. So again, we're given a sort of a theological kind of idea that in other parts of Tolkien's fiction finds challenge or finds, is complicated by the narrative. And I think we see this again and again in the Silmarillion, and we'll come back to this, where there are certain ideas, certain mythological or theological ideas, which elsewhere either are contradicted or don't quite play out in the way that you might have thought. And I think a lot of readers just take this as, the Silmarillion is basically the Bible of Middle-earth, and so we sort of trust what it says. Again, I think that's not what Tolkien is doing. I think we have to take it seriously as a kind of text in the story world. And if we do that, we can't just take it at face value. So that's why I think that, yes, these ideas like the idea of dominionism or, is a kind of biblical idea. And no doubt Tolkien was interested in that. But clearly, if one reads The Lord of the Rings, he's not only interested in just putting that idea across. He's interested in thinking about that idea as it would play out in a story or, and so he's not interested in just, I think, giving the reader sort of theological precepts about how the world works within his story world or in the real world. And if it seems like he's doing that in the Silmarillion, I think that's, frankly, I think that's because people are reading it wrong. I think they're reading it as a kind of window into the world, into this story world, as they call it. Not just me, but that sort of phrase is used of these worlds within the space of a novel or a book or a creative endeavor. But yeah, I don't know. I know I keep coming back to that, but I think these first few chapters really, yeah.
So essentially, you're basically, just to sort of get it clear in my own head, you're saying that there's basically one camp that would essentially read the sort of, for lack of a better word, the canon of like Middle-earth stories as the Lord of the Rings and like The Hobbit maybe, and then the rest is basically is told from some sort of quasi extra textual, like you said, like a window into the text. But you're placing the Silmarillion sort of within the actual the text itself, right? Is that what I'm getting?
Kind of, well, yes. I think it's a text within the story world. It sort of more or less explicitly is, because it's meant to be a translation of Tolkien changed his mind, but essentially a translation of lore, right, of Elvish lore. But looking back from some time in the, as it were, the far imagined future, looking back at these events, and my point is only that any text we would do that in the real world, we would assume that, or we would not assume, I think, if we're diligent readers, we would not assume that such a text was a window into sort of a universal vision of the past, but is sort of circumscribed in various ways. I just think we have to read this text in the same way. And there's certain kinds of evidence that Tolkien himself thought that, and whether he thought that or not is sort of beside the point. It's certainly written in that way. I mean, as I've said before, I think quite a few scholars have identified certain features of bias, certain features of uncertainty in the text, where, and certainly Christopher Tolkien himself notes in his introduction that the text is written again from that sort of point of view of a far future, looking back at a deep past. And so, I think what's more interesting than looking at the Silmarillion as a kind of just unproblematic window into this world is thinking about it as a feature of the story world itself, and therefore, as a kind of a window, perhaps also into, not so much the exact events, but into the ways that the people in the story kind of understand their own history, I suppose.
Interesting. Yeah.
But
I'm sold on that.
Well, I don't know. I mean, yeah. Again, I think a lot of people would disagree.
To me, I mean, whether that's right or wrong or whatever, to me that does sound like the more interesting version of it,
I mean,
as a literary exercise, that is certainly the more
interesting.
That's certainly the more interesting one. Yeah.
And so, I know we've taken a sort of a very sort of high position on these chapters, but that's because these are, fairly short chapters, and they're really developing a kind of mythological perspective, I think, on the past. And we see that, of course, in, for example, if you read Roman history, the more in the past you go, the more mythological and sort of weird it gets. And we see the same thing in the Silmarillion. It starts in a kind of theologico-religious manner. We transition to myth, and then we transitioned into something more approximating history with greater detail, etc. And we see that, of course, culminate in the Lord of the Rings and other texts which present the Third Age as the most historically drawn of the ages. And so in that sense, the whole endeavor reflects the development of not only history in a sense, but historiography in the real world, which is interesting. And so I think that's how we need to approach Tolkien's text. And
Tolkien was he a historian by trade?
Well, he was a philologist, but yes, I mean, he was, of course, working in an area that was more or less adjacent to history, the history of languages, in part. So, yeah, absolutely, intimately familiar with ancient historical writing and other kinds of things like that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I don't have much to add to that. That would be interesting, but I think that's very interesting.
So, we've covered a whole lot of ground, actually, or I have. I'm sorry if I have. I've just dominated.
Yeah, I mean, you clearly have got a lot of interesting things to say on this. But, so I'm happy to just sit back and watch the fireworks.
But yeah, next time I think, we'll start to get into the elves and some of their political allegiances and alliances and differences when they come back to Valinor and they settle in Eldamar, Elvenhome, which is a slightly ironic name, of course, because their home is actually Middle-earth.
Yeah.
And when they return to Middle-earth, they're called exiles, but they're really double exile. It gets complicated. But that's part of the interest of it, I think. So we'll really start to get into that. And that's where we'll begin to see something of that historicizing style as opposed to mythological. So, next time we might do at least chapter 5 and maybe Feanor as well.
Sure.
But, was there anything, I guess, anything else to add? I feel like I've said enough. Well, I shouldn't say anymore.
Yeah. No. Was there something about theodicies specifically that you want to bring up, or?
I think I've sort of covered it. I was just going to mention that, there was this question of whether or not the idea of this primal light, this primal beauty, and even the word, I've mentioned the word symmetry, which is used explicitly in the text. So one gets this image of this sort of land of changeless symmetry. It's almost like a geometrical thing, geometrical space, a space of perfect geometry, I should say. And then that's broken, right, by Melkor, and then we sort of have time. Time itself sort of is a kind of wrecker. And so the question is, does that contradict with this theodicy, this notion that's given in the Ainulindalë, the sort of creation myth, and is sort of repeated in a couple of places in these earlier chapters, that to introduce discord and disharmony is sort of somehow conducive to even greater beauty, that somehow beauty, is instantiated not only in sort of geometrical perfection, but somehow in sort of disunity, in the brokenness, which is, I call it theodicy because it's sort of, it is, I guess, the explanation that's given in the Ainulindalë for, why is there bad, why is there evil? That's the text, that's the answer that text gives to the problem of evil. It's that, well, yes, evil is bad. We don't deny that, but it's also kind of better that it exists because it sort of, it leads to even greater things. Now, personally, I find this a fairly silly theodicy. It's not convincing as an answer, but it is a it's the kind of explanation that various especially I guess especially in Christian context, but others as well, people sort of give to that question, and in some of these early chapters, Tolkien attempts to kind of mythologize that. I think later on in the text he more or less gives up on that idea. I don't think that idea is sort of actually, again, a lot of people will disagree with me, but I don't think that idea is a really central one to understanding Tolkien's text. I think it's in there because it's a kind of easy theodicy, and like all authors dealing with sort of quasi-Christian mythological ideas and texts, he has to give one at least, but I don't think it really informs the legendarium particularly, at least not as much as some people think. But yeah, that's what I sort of meant by that.
Yeah. I wonder if there's anything there that sort of ties into what you were saying about the sort of place of the Silmarillion, as a sort of myth within the text, because I too think that it's kind of a silly idea, and I think it's silly when people sort of put forth ideas like this in the real world.
Yeah,
in the
absolutely,
real world. But I wonder if that too we can sort of read as something that is said in the way that it's said in the real world, as like as a myth to just as a myth / coping mechanism, to deal with entropy. It's like I wonder how much. I don't know if that's making any sense, but like I wonder how much of this is supposed to be taken at face value and how much of it is supposed to be sort of read as a sort of elvish coping mechanism, because
it's elvish cope.
It's elvish cope, exactly. Yeah,
I think
to be truly honest, I'm not sure that any argument about the introduction of discord to enhance beauty, I'm not sure that really would fly in any real sense, just philosophically. So I don't know. What you think about that?
I mean, I think it's dangerous to take Tolkien's ideas here. Not dangerous, but misguided. Say to take Tolkien's idea here as sort of, Tolkien's seriously thinking about theology and sort of. I mean, yes, on one level he is, but again, we have to come back to the status of this. It's a literary object. This text. It's not a theological discourse. And as much as Tolkien may have had theological sentiments and ideas, I don't think he always sticks with them. I think sometimes they're contradicted in the text, even within the Silmarillion itself. Like any good novelist, I don't think Tolkien's ideas are sort of fully formed and sort of given thesis-like detail, or sort of set out in thesis-like detail in these literary texts. I don't think that's what literature is about. I think it's sort of the opposite of philosophy and theology in that sense. It's about deconstructing, or perhaps not deconstructing, but it's about allowing sort of unresolvable ideas and sentiments and feelings to coexist. And I think even though this text does have these mythological / theological ideas, for example, theodicy that we've been talking about, I think that they, as I said, they are not always given full consideration in the narrative. For example, I think they're sort of, if they're not contradicted, they're sort of shunted to the side, right? I've made the argument before that I think, for example, the Children of Húrin, that novel particularly, sort of undermines the whole theodicy that is given in the Silmarillion. It undermines it as a convincing, at least as a convincing kind of idea, and not only that, but also other other texts as well in Tolkien's fiction, and even the Lord of the Rings, I think, has a different message. I don't think the message of the Lord of the Rings is well, evil is good, is actually kind of good, because it leads to it leads to beautiful things in the end, or conflict or discord or whatever is actually kind of preferable to perfect harmony. I think the mythological idea at the center of that theodicy is that, as we see in these first chapters, again in that sort of more mythological sense, is that discord and there is a certain value in the features of the world that are discordant, that are that betray asymmetry. Symmetries can be well, by their nature, if you look at a crystal or something, that they can be repetitive. They can sort of get boring. What we often find interesting in nature is are those parts of it which don't, which are sort of in some sense imperfect. If we're thinking about like visual kind of features of nature, like in a crystal or something. So I think that's the mythological idea that's kind of interesting in that theodicy, but I don't think it as a kind of explanation of like, I don't know, God's intentions. Obviously I don't think it works. And indeed, some people I've heard recently have made the point that if you really try and seriously push that idea as an explanation of God's purposes, one loses all capacity for moral evaluation, because one never knows when a good or a bad act is actually conducing to some later historical outcome, which is only available to God's mind, but not to one's own. So how does one make moral judgments in such a universe? So I think the whole thing is impossible. But I think it's what people often miss is it's the mythological element in that idea that's interesting, I think.
A real quick analogy. I mean, I think there's something interesting about 17th and really like early 18th century music, roughly like the Baroque era, which is what I sort of gravitate to the most. And I think people think that maybe someone like Bach wrote very sort of organized and symmetrical music, but actually if you really study it, it's really not. It's very organized, but it's ultimately kind of wandering, right? It's the harmonies they're not really balanced in exactly the way that later on you would see from Mozart or Haydn. So there was a break, it seems to me, around the Enlightenment even in music, right? Where some of the sort of the idea that music was a sort of expression of the mysteries of God's mind or something like that was maybe taken away a little bit, and it more became a sort of logical enterprise. And that's when you really start to see symmetrical music cropping up. Like the sort of perfectly architectured phrases of Mozart. If you really listen to Bach, he'll start on a sort of chromatic wandering, and then he'll just end up somewhere. And it sort of defies traditional analyses in an interesting way.
The whole message of Amadeus is that we should actually have supported Salieri all along, or that Salieri actually should have got the emperor's imprimatur all along.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about Salieri's music. Maybe it was terrible, but
no, he was great there. And by all accounts, for what it's worth, Salieri and Mozart were actually amicable colleagues.
Yeah. I've heard that. Yeah, I mean, the movie's wonderful, of course, but it does ham up. Yeah, although Mozart was meant to be quite a ham artist, right? Like, he's quite.
Yeah. I think he definitely was a professional at loving people the wrong way.
Yeah.
Many of whom were not his wife, I should add.
But, you're funny. Anyway, I mean, I think the movie touches on that too, doesn't it? I seem to remember.
Yeah.
It's been a while since I've seen it, but great film. Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, I think that's good. Was there anything final to add? I mean, as I said before, I keep talking, so I don't want to linger too long, but
no. I think that's it from me. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, for what it's worth, I found what you said here like totally fascinating and sort of enlightening, and I'm glad that we had this conversation early on, because it's going to affect the way that I read
and
the rest of it. Because I think, I think I read other Middle-earth texts in a more sort of literary way, just by my nature. But I think without even thinking, I sort of tapped into a more theological reading with the Silmarillion, without it being very conscious. I think I just kind of approached it like that, because that's just how I think I was supposed to approach it.
And it certainly does invite that. I mean, I'm not saying that one cannot read it that way. I just think that, or one shouldn't. I'm not saying.
No, but it's more interesting.
I just think we have to remember that it is on some level a literary project, and it's trying to do certain things. And one can forget that, because I think it doesn't have a framing device, which Tolkien had originally written. That was left out because, for complex reasons, and probably ultimately for the best. But certainly it is an artifact of the story world, and it's explicitly thought to have been so by Tolkien himself. So it's not simply it's not simply a D&D guide, to the world. It's not a lore book, which is meant to be taken sort of face value,
I think that makes it much more interesting. So
yeah, it does. Yeah, and so for listeners also, I just want to say in this series, obviously, we are just assuming that people come to this either having recently read the text or having a sense of what it says. We're not really doing recaps or things like that, because we're just assuming people know what we're talking about. So just have that bear that in mind.
Yeah.
But
for the people who listen to an hour of us talking,
exactly. I should have said that at the start. Anyway, I'm sure I said that in the first episode. I don't know, but no, thank you.
I just like the of a listener, making it an hour in, and they're like, damn, I thought they were going to do
I know. I should have said that at the start, but I guess it's just more of a general point.
It's funny.
Anyway, so I think that that brings us to a close with that one. And next time we'll get into the elves. And I know we didn't really talk about the elves here, but we will talk about them next time. And perhaps we'll go back a little bit as well, talk about Elwë and Thingol and Melian a little bit too. So in any case, we're up to chapter 5, and the elves have reached Valinor, the sort of home away from home, at least for a while, and we'll take it up from there. So thanks, everyone, and we'll see you then.